Often, as Americans, we get told a story about the Constitutional Convention that borders on the divine. Regularly, the framers get spoken about as though they had brought forth the Constitution, almost as Moses carried the stone tablets from Mount Sinai. In reality, of course, these were men that often did not agree with each other, and it took much convincing and compromises to get to a final draft, which would then be further amended with the Bill of Rights. So, how different would the Constitution be had they kept some of their ideas? Join me for a look at the top 10 proposals that were left on the cutting room floor. Before we start, I should note that these are only proposals that were rejected within what would eventually become our current system. At the convention, there were a minority of delegates, like John Lansing Jr. of New York, that wanted to work entirely within the Articles of Confederation. Those were obviously rejected by the Constitution itself. Number 1, supermajorities for commercial laws. One of the things that people who find the American government to be way more massive than it should be point to as a misinterpretation is the Commerce Clause, an enumerated power that Congress has often used to expand regulation. But at the convention, Charles Pinckney of South Carolina proposed that any commercial legislation should pass only with the consent of 2/3 of both houses. The measure was supported by multiple Southerners. The reason was that they were apprehensive Congress would impose tariffs on the exports and imports of Southern states, a conflict that would persist for another 80 years. Unfortunately for them, the rest of the framers were skeptical of supermajorities generally, and given their experience with the Articles of Confederation, were convinced that the regulation of commerce was absolutely central to their vision of a better system of government. Had this passed, the government's footprint might be smaller, but maybe the American economy as well. 2. Federal veto to state laws. At the start of the convention, while he waited for the necessary quorum, James Madison drafted what came to be known as the Virginia Plan, a proposal that set the agenda for the convention and looked to explicitly create a supreme national government that would have authority over citizens directly, not just through states. Thus, Madison proposed a federal veto on state laws because he said, the tendency of the parts to encroach on the authority of the whole will continue to disturb the system, unless effectually controlled, and nothing short of a negative on their laws will control it. This was especially true, he contended, because even though Congress could still preempt through legislation state laws that were perceived to be against the national interest, state laws might accomplish their injurious objects before the federal authorities could overrule them. Moreover, although some delegates argued that a judiciary could already do that and a veto was unnecessary, Madison argued that it would be foolish to expect state judges to be guardians of the national authority and interests because of their dependency on state legislatures. This was supported by Pinckney, who thought Congress should have the power to block all state laws that Congress judged to be improper. But in the end, the delegates found it too impractical a measure. Had this passed, it is possible it would have been used to stop abolition laws and personal liberty laws that aimed to counter the Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850 that were meant to force states to return any enslaved person who escaped to their masters. 3. A constitutional ban on a standing army larger than a few thousand soldiers. A concern that many delegates shared at the convention was the danger of having a standing army during peacetime. For that reason, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts proposed setting a limit of 2,000 to 3,000 troops. He argued that an army would be dangerous in time of peace and there would be great opposition to the Constitution if no definite number was set. Although other delegates shared the standing army concerns, they were also worried about practical matters, especially whether Congress would be able to mobilize the needed number of men in case of invasion. Encroachments by Spain and potential future armed conflict with Britain and France made this an easy rejection. Had this been part of the Constitution, it might have been amended in the aftermath of one of the world wars, but the possibilities of what might have been are endless. 4. a house where its members would have much different terms and forms of election. When the convention discussed the way that the House should be elected, one of the ways that was seriously proposed was at large elections. That is, if, say, New York sent 10 representatives to Congress, there would be no separate districts that they would run in, but instead they could get votes from anywhere in the state. So candidate A could get votes only in New York City, and candidate B could get votes anywhere in the state and could still win so long as they had the most votes. Madison argued that this would confine the choice to characters of general notoriety and so far be favorable to merit. George Clymer of Pennsylvania agreed, saying that this would ensure good and respectable representation. It was also popular outside of the convention. During the ratification debates, the Federalists said that single-member districts were contrary to the true spirit of the Constitution, which aims at being as national as possible in the choice of representatives. The framers also discussed shorter and longer terms for representatives. Eldridge Gerry of Massachusetts insisted that annual elections were the only defense of the people against tyranny, but others disagreed. Daniel of St. Thomas Jenifer from Maryland explained that shorter terms would render the people indifferent to them and made the best men unwilling to engage in so precarious a service. A big problem was the one that Madison pointed to. One-year terms would be almost completely consumed in preparing for and traveling to and from the seat of national business. The convention did vote in favor of 3-year terms at one point, but changed its mind. One wonders how this might have changed current politics. Certainly annual elections today would not be a problem in terms of travel, but in terms of raising money. As it is, that seems to be more than 50% of what representatives do. Having at-large constituencies, though, might make it easier for third parties to get their candidates to win. That is because normally they would be the third choice in a given district and thus perennial losers, but it would be possible that they could be the 53rd choice in a place like California, and thus they could gain representation. Fifth, a very different Senate. For one, they would not be paid. They would be directly elected by people. There would be 3 of them instead of 2, and in order for their vote to count, they would all have to agree. That is, they would not vote independently, but as a unit. The reason the framers considered not paying them was because, as Pinckney of South Carolina noted, senators were meant to represent the wealth of the nation. The founders also considered 4-year terms. Coatsworth Pinckney, for example, argued that terms that were longer would fix senators at the seat of government, where they would acquire an interest, perhaps transfer their property, and lose sight of the states they represent. But there were many others who were supportive of even longer terms. There was Richard Dobbs of North Carolina, who insisted on 7-year terms, which were the same as parliamentary terms in England. Wilson of Pennsylvania suggested 9-year terms because senators would have to be made respectable in the eyes of foreign nations. And Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris even proposed senators for life. Surprisingly, this got some support among other delegates. Charles Pinckney, Robert Morris, and George Read agreed that there should be senators for life. In the end, the closest that came to being reality was the 7-year term. 2 weeks in, the convention voted in favor of that, but later changed its mind. A world in which senators would not be paid would have made the Senate even more of a redoubt of the rich, but it might not seem like much of a difference in practice. A scenario in which 3 senators would have to agree on anything for their vote to count, however, does seem like an interesting change, especially if they were there for life. In the world of 2020, that would make purple states have less representation, but maybe we wouldn't have gotten many purple states in the first place if this had been in place from the beginning. Then again, it might mean that the Senate might have rarely agreed on anything, which might end up making the Senate more like the House of Lords in England, which is to say, one with a lot more rich people, but much less power. Sixth, 3 presidents at the same time that might be voted by people or Congress. One of the biggest questions that the convention had to figure out was how to create an executive that would be far stronger than the one designed in the Articles of Confederation, which was basically non existent, but one that was not as strong as the King of England, which the US had just fought a revolution over. Given that, one of the proposals was to have an executive with three people at the same time that would be elected from different parts of the country. George Mason of Virginia argued that this setup would lead to a more perfect and extensive knowledge of the real interests of this great union, and thus would quiet the minds of the people and convince them that there will be proper attention paid to their respective concerns. Williamson of North Carolina declared, in light of the essential difference of interest between the northern and southern states, particularly in the carrying trade, it would be dangerous to have a unitary executive who would have to be chosen from one region or the other. This proposal was nixed relatively early, mostly because of the practical constraints that would result in coordination problems and internal strife. Nonetheless, one does wonder if having three presidents might have avoided or accelerated the Civil War. On the one hand, the immediate cause for the war was the election of Lincoln in 1860, which would never have happened under the scenario of three presidents. On the other hand, maybe the United States would have been less prosperous even then, or broken up soon after, as a triumvirate might have exacerbated some of the differences between the North and the South. Seventh, much broader reasons for impeachment. Originally, impeachment was much broader than it is now. As first proposed, Congress could remove the president for what Madison called malpractice or neglect of duty, which, if put in practice, would basically mean that the president would serve at the pleasure of Congress. At first, the framers also considered making the Supreme Court the body that would adjudicate the case. As we all know, today, a president is only supposed to be tried for crimes and misdemeanors. And although in practice this has meant whatever Congress decides it means, there's still the presumption that the president has done something untoward. Being really bad at their job is not enough for removal. We just have to learn to live with that when it happens. Had this original vision of impeachment prevailed, it's possible that the United States would have turned into a system closer to the parliamentary system in Europe, or at the very least, one where Congress would be far more powerful than it is now. Given that a main consideration had been that the president should not be too dependent on Congress, however, the framers decided to make it much harder for Congress to remove the president. Eighth, president would have to share their veto power with the judiciary. As first proposed, the framers talked about not a veto, but a council of revision. This council would be filled with federal judges who, together with the president, would decide whether they agreed with a law or not. Some of the founders thought that judges would offer valuable assistance in preserving a consistency, conciseness, perspicuity, and technical propriety in the laws. Some of them also suggested that it should be absolute, that is, Congress would not be able to override it at all. I'm not sure how this might have changed American politics, but the idea of the Supreme Court or any judge sitting around waiting to decide whether or not to veto something does seem like something that wouldn't have lasted very long, especially because this would probably have politicized the judiciary far more than it has been. Ninth, appointing the bureaucracy would have been left up to the Senate. One of the things the framers considered was that the president could not possibly have personal knowledge of as many qualified candidates for appointment as the Senate would. And Sherman added that the Senate collectively would have greater wisdom than the president on who to appoint. The main reason they did not, however, was that they thought that if the Senate was in charge of appointing the bureaucracy, they would simply keep creating positions they might corruptly fill. In other words, it might simply be too much of a temptation for Congress to have this power. 10th, presidential terms would have been much longer, maybe as long as 20 years. Longer presidential terms were much closer to becoming a reality than you might think. The convention originally voted for presidents to serve single 7-year terms with no possibility of re-election, but many others thought terms should be even longer. Luther Martin suggested 11 years. Williamson of North Carolina offered 10 to 12. Eldridge Gerry offered an even longer term of 15 or 20 years. The idea was that longer terms would encourage the best men to opt for public life. Even after the convention decided to shorten the single-year term, They agreed on a 6-year term with the possibility for re-election, but later changed their minds. So how would longer presidential terms have changed American politics? Perhaps not much early on, when out of the first 8 presidents, only 3 did not serve 2 terms. But it might have been crucial in the middle of the 19th century when new leadership was needed, but many fewer men would have been elected. As a result, Lincoln might not have been one of those people. In the 21st century, who knows? The idea of any person lasting that long in office without facing the voters seems like a great recipe for disaster. So those are the top 10 changes that could have been for the Constitution. Would you have kept some of them? Would we have been better off if we had? Tell me in the comments.